I ended the last video by talking about the body's physical response to stressors. In this video, I'll talk more about our cognitive and behavioral responses. But as we'll soon see, all of these types of responses are linked, with each being able to shape the other. If you've ever seen the movie Finding Nemo, you might remember that two of the main characters, Dory and Marlin, often respond very differently to stressful situations. Dory always tends to look on the bright side. For example, when she meets a big, scary whale, she isn't concerned about being eaten. Rather, she's excited by the opportunity to potentially make a new friend. Marlin, on the other hand, has much more negative reactions to potentially threatening situations, always interpreting them in the worst possible way. Stated differently, Dory and Marlin often have two very different cognitive appraisals of the same event. A cognitive appraisal is simply a person's subjective interpretation of a situation. And, as the example with Dory and Marlin illustrates, not all of us interpret events in the same way. For example, imagine getting ready to take a big exam in an important class that you need to graduate. What thoughts are running through your mind as you approach taking the exam? Are you really worried about the potential negative consequences if you don't do well? Or do you relish the challenge of mastering new, interesting material? It turns out that these different interpretations can have important effects not only for our emotions, but also for our physical response to stress as well. Recall that in the previous video, I defined a stressor as something that we perceive as being potentially demanding or threatening, and this word perceive is important. If we perceive something as a threat, this not only causes the negative emotional state of feeling stressed out, but it also triggers a physical reaction by our sympathetic nervous system and HPA axis, as we learned about in the last video. And certainly, some events, like encountering a poisonous snake or hearing the fire alarm go off in your home in the middle of the night, might very rightly be interpreted as potentially threatening, in which case our fight or flight response will give our bodies the boost of energy it needs to effectively deal with the situation. However, just because something might be difficult doesn't necessarily mean that it must be interpreted as threatening. Specifically, appraisal theory, developed by Richard Lazarus, proposes that when people encounter a potential stressor, they can interpret it in one of two different ways. First, people could make a threat appraisal of the situation. That is, they see the situation as a potential for some kind of harm or loss. This type of cognitive appraisal usually results in feelings of distress. Remember, this is the bad kind of stress. For example, imagine that you have to give a big presentation for one of your classes. If you made a threat appraisal, that would mean seeing this as something that could potentially expose your flaws, cause you embarrassment, and maybe sink your grade in the course. However, this same stressor could be reinterpreted not as a threat, but as an opportunity to help you improve your skills, showcase your abilities, and gain recognition. When we view potential stressors as an opportunity for growth and mastery, this is called a challenge appraisal. Making a challenge appraisal typically results in eustress. Remember, eustress is the good kind of stress, and positive emotions such as excitement and enthusiasm. According to appraisal theory, this process of cognitively labeling a potential stressor as either a threat or a challenge is only the first in a two-step process. During primary appraisal, the first step, the person labels the stressor as either a threat or a challenge. If the person labels the situation as a challenge, then the process ends. However, if the person labels the situation as a threat, then that person moves on to the next step in the process called secondary appraisal. In secondary appraisal, the person evaluates whether he or she has the necessary resources to cope with the stressful situation. So going back to our example with giving a big presentation, the person might interpret it as a threat, but nonetheless believe that they can effectively cope by adequately practicing and preparing. This would be experienced as a low-threat situation. However, if the person does not think that they can effectively cope, for example, perhaps they believe that they are a hopeless public speaker and no amount of preparation will do, then this would be experienced as a high-threat situation. As I hinted at earlier, these different cognitive appraisals can actually change our body's physical response to a perceived stressor. For example, one famous study had participants complete something called the Trier Social Stress Test. In the Trier Social Stress Test, participants have to give a 5-minute speech to an evaluative panel that has been instructed not to give any kind of positive nonverbal feedback, like smiling or nodding. Next, participants have to perform a difficult math exercise under time pressure in front of the same panel. I think most of us would find this to be a little bit stressful. Importantly, however, the researchers found that participants made different cognitive appraisals of this event, and those differing cognitive appraisals affected both their emotions and their physiology. Specifically, some participants interpreted the task as a threat. That is, they focused on the potential for harm that might come from doing poorly on the speech and math exercise. But other participants interpreted that same task as more of a challenge. Instead of focusing on the potential for harm, these participants instead focused on opportunities for growth. These participants not only reported feeling less stressed out by the event, but their cortisol levels were also lower than participants who interpreted that same event as a threat. So perceiving stressors as being more of a challenge versus a threat can actually down-regulate our HPA axis response, which can have beneficial health effects in the long run. Okay, let's pause for an application practice question. Vanessa is getting ready to attend graduate school and is a little bit nervous about it. Which of the following would be Vanessa making a challenge appraisal about grad school? The correct answer is C. In a challenge appraisal, you are still seeing something as challenging, that is, as potentially difficult, but also potentially rewarding by creating opportunities for personal growth and mastery. A final part of responding to stressors are the behaviors that we actually engage in, and these are called coping strategies. There are many different types of coping strategies, but researchers usually group them into two general categories: problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused coping involves direct attempts to manage or control the stressor itself. So for example, if you're worried about a big upcoming exam, more problem-focused coping might include things like going to the instructor's office hours, seeking out a tutor, or putting together a study group with fellow classmates. Emotion-focused coping, on the other hand, seeks to manage one's negative emotional reactions to the stressor. For example, reinterpreting a stressor as a challenge instead of a threat would be an emotion-focused coping strategy. Other emotion-focused strategies might include things like journaling or exercising. Whether an emotion-focused or problem-focused coping strategy is more beneficial depends a lot on whether the person has control over the situation to begin with. When you do have control, using more problem-focused coping strategies can be especially beneficial because they directly deal with the problem at hand. So for example, when experiencing something like job loss, someone using problem-focused coping may start putting together their resume and searching the job boards to try and find something new. In these situations, emotion-focused coping can sometimes be helpful too, but it can also be harmful if it leads the person to avoid dealing with the problem altogether. For example, have you ever had a big exam coming up, but rather than studying, you chose to binge watch Netflix instead? Or maybe, like me, you're also really great at simply avoiding any kind of emotional conflict with friends rather than addressing any potential issues in the relationship. Although these avoidance strategies do temporarily relieve our negative feelings of stress and anxiety, in the long run, they are ultimately unhelpful and may cause us to even feel more stress in the end when the problem persists. However, when someone faces a situation over which they have very little control, such as experiencing the loss of a loved one, the person may use more emotion-focused coping strategies because there's very little they can do to actually change the situation to begin with. Emotion and problem-focused coping strategies are also not mutually exclusive. That is, people can engage in more than one type of strategy when facing a stressful event. And some actions, like seeking social support, can serve both purposes. For example, friends and family can provide us with emotional comfort when we face stressful situations, and they can also sometimes help in practical ways too, such as offering guidance or providing financial support. According to the buffering hypothesis, social support can actually act as a kind of buffer that protects against the harmful effects of stress. Moreover, these protective effects are especially evident in high-stress situations. So why might social support be so beneficial? Well, there are a number of potential different reasons, but there's some interesting research that social support itself can actually have some direct positive physical effects on our bodies. Specifically, experiencing social support increases the release of a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin plays a key role in emotional attachment, and importantly, it also downregulates the HPA axis by inhibiting the release of CRF from the hypothalamus and ACTH from the pituitary gland. Remember that although increased activation of the HPA axis can be helpful in the short term for acute stressors, in the long run, elevated HPA axis activity can have harmful effects on our cardiovascular and immune systems. So when facing chronic stressors, having a good social support system can help to minimize these negative consequences by downregulating our HPA axis and cortisol levels. In this video, I discussed our cognitive and behavioral response to stressors and how these responses can actually change our physical responses too. For the exam, you should be able to define cognitive appraisal, discuss the process of primary and secondary appraisal that occurs when people encounter a potential stressor, define and distinguish between a challenge versus a threat appraisal and identify them in an example, define and distinguish between problem-focused and emotion-focused coping strategies and identify them in an example, discuss which type of coping strategies might be more versus less effective in different situations, and explain the buffering hypothesis and discuss why social support might be helpful both for emotional well-being and physical well-being too.